Have you ever given someone your trust with your whole heart? No second thoughts, no hesitation, only to discover, eventually, that they never truly deserved it? That kind of realization doesn't tap you on the shoulder. It hits you like a wave, unannounced and hard. And for a moment, it takes the breath out of your chest. Because we all want to believe in the good in people. We want to believe that the smile someone offers, the warmth in their tone, the gestures of care are real. But sometimes behind that polished surface, behind those perfectly timed words and careful acts, lies something far more dangerous. Someone who wears loyalty like a mask, someone whose intentions are not to build, but to slowly chip away at your sense of self. And that's where clarity becomes a kind of strength, not the kind that pushes people away, but the kind that protects the parts of you you've worked hard to understand, to heal, to grow. This isn't about becoming cold. It's not about turning your back on kindness or vulnerability. It's about being awake, being clear, learning the patterns, knowing when to walk, not because you hate someone, but because you finally love yourself enough to leave. Stoic wisdom tells us over and over again that we cannot control the winds around us, but we can control how we sail. In choosing who gets to sail beside you, that's not just preference, that's power. It's subtle in the beginning. A person enters your life gently, wrapped in charm, offering a shoulder, mirroring your thoughts, listening with intensity. You think, finally, someone who gets it, someone who gets me. But over time, the listening turns into questioning, the questions turn into control. At first, it looks like love, checking in on you, remembering the little things, offering support. But with time, you realize that what felt like care has become surveillance. What once felt like affection now feels like a script. I once watched someone I cared about fall deeply into this kind of dynamic. A relationship that began with encouragement and laughter slowly became a quiet battlefield. Every compliment came with a condition. Every moment of vulnerability was stored and later turned into a weapon. He began shrinking, not physically, but spiritually. His decisions, once spontaneous and joyful, were now filtered through another person's expectations. He doubted his own voice, questioned his own worth. And the saddest part? He thought that was love. He thought that kind of ache was normal. Manipulation is not always loud. It doesn't always wear anger on its sleeve. Sometimes it comes dressed in concern, cloaked in compliments, but underneath, it's a strategy, carefully laid out, methodically executed. You'll find yourself explaining your thoughts more than you express them, apologizing for things you didn't do, walking on eggshells without knowing why. And you'll call it compromise. You'll call it communication. But deep down, something in you will know it isn't right. That's where self-awareness becomes your armor. Not the kind that turns you bitter, but the kind that says, I see what's happening. I feel the shift. And I trust myself enough to honor it. Stoicism teaches us that peace comes not from avoiding discomfort, but from facing reality with an open and steady heart. So when someone in your life makes you feel like you're too much, or not enough, or like your value depends on their mood, step back, observe, pay attention to how you feel after every interaction. That feeling is a signal. That discomfort is not paranoia, it's intuition. You don't need dramatic exits. You don't need revenge or explanation. What you need is quiet clarity. You need boundaries that don't shake under guilt or pressure. You need the kind of stillness that lets you sleep at night, knowing you didn't betray yourself just to keep someone else comfortable. When someone shows you that they twist your words, gaslight your reality, and weaponize your openness, that's not someone who deserves access to your spirit. And then there are the critics, the ones who mask their superiority behind advice, the ones who listen not to understand, but to judge. Their tone is condescending. Their compliments are laced with conditions. You could tell them about a dream you've nurtured for years, and they'll find the flaw. You could celebrate a win you worked hard for, and they'll deflate it with a raised eyebrow or a subtle scoff. It doesn't come from wisdom, it comes from insecurity, from a place that cannot tolerate someone else rising if they themselves feel like they're standing still. These are the voices you'll begin to hear in your own mind if you're not careful. You'll start filtering your joy, dimming your light, apologizing for your own expansion. And that's where the damage begins, not in the words they say, but in the way you begin to say them to yourself. Stoicism doesn't ask you to silence others. It asks you to anchor yourself so deeply in your own truth that those voices lose their power. Imagine your mind like a fortress. You wouldn't let every traveler walk through its gates unfiltered. So why allow every opinion to settle into your self-concept? Not all criticism is constructive. Some of it is projection. Some of it is a desperate attempt to bring you down to a level someone else feels stuck in. And you don't need to fight them. You don't need to prove your worth. What you need is discernment, the ability to hear what's being said and still know who you are. And there are the ones who move like shadows, weaving from one conversation to the next, carrying stories not their own. They don't gossip because they're evil. They gossip because they're lost, because retelling stories gives them a moment of attention, a moment where they feel important. But trust built with someone who shares everyone's secrets is a house built on sand. If they talk about others to you, they'll talk about you to others. That's a truth you don't need evidence to believe. I once shared something small, a passing moment of vulnerability, with someone I thought I could trust. Within a week, fragments of that moment were reshaped, dramatized, and passed around like decoration. I didn't feel just betrayed, I felt exposed. And in that moment, I promised myself, my story, my struggle, my sacred moments, they deserve better. They deserve safety, and not everyone is safe. The ones who gossip aren't just breaking trust, they're revealing that they don't understand what intimacy truly is. Because real closeness isn't built in whispered betrayals. It's built in silence, in presence, in the quiet, knowing that what's shared will be held with honor. And if someone doesn't know how to do that, that's not your problem to fix. That's your signal to protect yourself. You don't need to confront, correct, or expose. You just need to adjust your access. Trust isn't a gift you give freely, it's a seed. And it should only be planted where you know it will grow into something worthy of your time, your energy, your heart. There is a kind of silence that arrives after you've walked away from someone who once felt like home. It's not empty, it's not hollow, it's full of echoes, of memories, of unspoken words and lessons that linger like morning fog. It doesn't announce its arrival with grief or anger. It just sits with you quietly as you begin to realize that peace is more precious than company. That solitude, when chosen, can be the most nourishing relationship you ever enter. He felt it after the last goodbye, the kind that doesn't always happen with a dramatic exit, but with a final inner nod that says, "I'm done." He didn't hate them. In truth, there wasn't even much resentment left, only understanding and a sense of release. It's funny how the same person who once made your world feel vivid can, over time, make your spirit feel small. Not because they're evil, but because the connection wasn't built on truth. It was built on fantasy, on projection, on old patterns that both people hadn't yet healed. And so it crumbled, not in a crash, but in slow erosion, where one day you wake up and realize this isn't love. This is attachment pretending to be love. This is fear of being alone disguised as connection. It takes courage to see that, to sit with that truth instead of numbing it. And he did. He sat with it on the quiet mornings when he wanted to reach out, on the late nights when nostalgia dressed up as longing. He didn't chase closure. He didn't beg for clarity. He created it himself. He wrote it in the way he rebuilt his routine, in the way he stopped checking their online status, in the way he let himself cry without judgment. That was the closure, his own self-honoring. He began to see how deeply he had confused love with performance, with pleasing, with giving until there was nothing left. He thought that if he just loved hard enough, stayed soft enough, apologized quickly enough, he'd finally be safe from abandonment. But he wasn't loved more for it. He was taken for granted. His silence was misread as agreement, his kindness mistaken for weakness. And when he finally said no, when he finally chose himself, it surprised them, because they had gotten used to a version of him that no longer existed. And that's the moment the shift begins. Not when they change, not when they come back, but when you realize you no longer need them to. You realize you're not waiting, you're not hoping, you're healing, you're expanding. You're creating a life that doesn't orbit around proving your worth to anyone. It's strange at first, this freedom, because it feels like loneliness until it becomes liberation. But once it clicks, once you taste that clarity, you'll never go back to begging for crumbs. You'll sit at your own table whole, even if alone. He learned that love doesn't hurt, attachment hurts, projection hurts. Loving someone who doesn't love themselves hurts. But love is clean. It uplifts, it gives without keeping score. He stopped calling his trauma bonds complicated relationships. He called them what they were, lessons. And he stopped blaming himself for staying too long. Because sometimes you don't stay because you're weak. You stay because you're loyal. Because you see the potential. Because you remember who they were before the mask slipped. But now he saw that potential isn't a promise, and love shouldn't require your suffering. He stopped romanticizing intensity, the chaos, the constant fixing. He used to think that if it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't deep. That love meant fighting hard and hurting often. But now peace felt more attractive. Safety, consistency, the kind of connection that doesn't leave you guessing, that doesn't leave your nervous system in shambles. And it took unlearning a lifetime of programming to believe that, to stop craving the roller coaster, to want soft and steady over loud and unstable. And in this space, this sacred space of separation, he met himself again. Not the version shaped by someone else's expectations, the real one, the boy who liked quiet mornings and slow conversations, the man who no longer apologized for needing space. He built a home within, decorated it with boundaries, planted flowers of forgiveness, not for them, but for himself. Because carrying bitterness was too heavy. Because being angry all the time stole too much beauty from the present. He learned to find wholeness in the mirror, to say, "You are enough," and actually believe it, not because he was perfect, not because he had all the answers, but because he had shown up for himself in the hardest season. He had held his own hand through the darkness. That kind of love, that's not self-help jargon. That's sacred. That's survival. That's something no one can take away once it's rooted. There were still moments that caught him off guard. A song, a smell, a street corner. And for a moment, it would all rush back. The laughter, the hope, the sweetness that once was. But he didn't push it away. He let it pass through like weather, acknowledged it like an old friend, then let it go. Because moving on doesn't mean erasing the past. It means releasing the grip it has on your future. He began to see red flags, not as mysteries to solve, but as truths to accept. He didn't try to decode mixed signals anymore. He believed them the first time. If someone said they weren't ready, he didn't try to make them ready. If someone showed they couldn't hold his heart with care, he didn't offer it again. He didn't play the role of healer, fixer, savior. He just lived with open eyes and a guarded soul. Not closed, but cautious. not jaded, but wise. He started using his pain as paint, turned it into art, into words, into conversations that could hold others in their own breaking. Because once you've rebuilt yourself, you don't gatekeep healing. You become a lighthouse, not to drag people to shore, but to remind them they can swim, that they're not alone in the storm. And he wasn't afraid of being seen anymore, not in his strength, not in his softness. He understood that his vulnerability wasn't a liability, it was a bridge. And when love returns, and it won't feel like a test. It won't make him question his value. It won't ask him to shrink. It will meet him where he is, with eyes that see, with presence that stays, with hands that hold, not because they need to fix him, but because they want to walk beside him. He won't confuse adrenaline for passion, won't mistake attention for connection. He'll know the difference, because now he knows himself. There was a point when he started noticing how quiet the world becomes when you stop explaining yourself. When you no longer feel the need to justify your boundaries, your distance, your decisions. It felt strange at first, like walking through fog after years of neon lights and noise. But it was peaceful, liberating, to know that he could simply choose to leave a conversation, choose not to answer a call, choose to protect his time and his energy without guilt gnawing at his edges. He no longer tried to make himself small to be palatable. He no longer diluted his needs just to keep the peace. And in that silence, he rediscovered his own voice, unfiltered, unedited, and undeniably true. He had spent so long believing that being available made him lovable, that sacrificing his own well-being to be there for others made him valuable. But that belief had cost him too much. It had left him burnt out, hollow, quietly resentful, always the listener, never the one heard, always the helper, rarely the helped. And he didn't blame those who leaned on him. He had taught them to with every "it's okay" when it wasn't, with every "I'm fine" when he was breaking. But now things had changed. He had learned to say, "Not today," to say, "I need space," to say, "This isn't working for me anymore." And those words, they weren't walls, they were doors, leading back to himself. He no longer took it personally when people left. Some departures came without warning, others came dressed in excuses, but all of them came with a gift: clarity. He used to ache for answers, beg for closure, replay every moment to find what he missed. But the more he sat with himself, the more he understood that people don't always leave because you did something wrong. Sometimes they leave because they're running from themselves, and other times because the version of you that tolerated their behavior no longer exists. He didn't chase, he didn't plead, he grieved, he let go. And he gave himself the gift of moving on without needing a grand finale. He learned to hold space for his own emotions without asking someone else to carry them. He no longer viewed sadness as weakness, no longer saw anger as something to be ashamed of. Emotions weren't enemies, they were messengers. When sadness came, he listened. When anger burned, he asked what boundary had been crossed. When joy visited, he didn't brace for its exit. He let it linger, danced with it, soaked in it. His emotional landscape became sacred terrain, not a battlefield. He didn't fight what he felt. He felt it fully, then let it go. Like waves on the shore, arriving, washing over, then retreating. He began to redefine intimacy. It wasn't just in touch or words. It was in being seen, fully, without needing to wear a mask. Intimacy was someone noticing the way your voice softens when you're tired, the way you fall silent when something's not right, the way your eyes shift when you're holding back tears. And he realized that real intimacy didn't demand perfection. It required presence. He stopped entertaining connections that made him feel like he had to audition, stopped pouring into dynamics that fed on his emotional labor without reciprocity. He wanted soft safety, deep understanding, that quiet electricity that comes when two souls meet without pretense. He also began honoring his creative self. For so long, he thought creativity had to look a certain way: big, bold, visible. But now he found it in the simple things: the way he arranged his morning tea, the way he curated his space, the way he wrote words that might never be read. He didn't need an audience. Creation for him became communion with himself, with the divine, with the moment. It was sacred, not performative. A way to process, to heal, to express. And in that, he discovered that his voice mattered, not because it echoed in others' ears, but because it rang true in his own chest. He made peace with being a work in progress. He no longer rushed his healing, no longer measured his worth by how quickly he bounced back. Growth wasn't linear. Some days felt like relapses. Some weeks felt like spirals. But through it all, he stayed with himself, with his breath, with his journey. He learned that relapse doesn't erase progress, that spiraling doesn't mean he's failing. It means he's human, and being human isn't a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be lived, tenderly, honestly, without shame. He stopped holding himself to the standards of a life he no longer wanted. He had outgrown certain dreams, certain definitions of success, and that was okay. He released the old blueprint, gave himself permission to reimagine everything. Maybe success now looked like a slow morning, like a journal entry, like an honest conversation. He wasn't building a life to impress the world. He was building a life that felt good in his bones. And that shift changed everything. Suddenly, he didn't feel behind. He felt aligned. He forgave his younger self, the version of him that tolerated too much, that stayed too long, that settled, that feared, that faltered. He saw now that that version of him was doing the best he could with the tools he had. He didn't need to resent that boy. He needed to love him, to thank him, because that boy had endured so much, had carried so many unspoken weights, and still survived, still hoped, still dreamed, still reached for healing. And without him, he wouldn't be here. He became more intentional with his time. He stopped saying yes to things that drained him, stopped filling his calendar with obligations that left him resentful. Every moment became sacred currency, and he spent it wisely, with people who nourished him, in places that inspired him, on things that aligned with his values. He no longer measured productivity in output, but in presence. How fully did I show up? How deeply did I feel? How honestly did I live today? These became his metrics. He also stopped trying to be understood by everyone. He realized that some people will always see you through the lens of their own limitation, their own pain, their own projections. And that's not your burden to carry. You're not responsible for how others interpret your journey. You're only responsible for living it with integrity, with courage, with heart. And once he let go of needing universal approval, he stepped into a new kind of freedom, the kind that comes from being fully himself, even when it's not convenient. He noticed how his inner world became quieter as he let go of old battles, the need to be right, the desire to win arguments, the compulsion to fix what was never his to fix. He chose peace over pride, chose softness over stubbornness, not because he lacked conviction, but because he valued his energy. He knew now that some people don't want resolution, they want drama. They want the performance of healing without the work. And he didn't audition for those roles anymore. In all of this, he returned to his center, a place not defined by titles, achievements, relationships, or applause, but by presence, by breath, by the quiet knowing that he is enough here and now. And from that place, he began to live, not to impress, not to prove, not to survive, but to simply be. And that being, it was the most powerful, most radical, most beautiful act of all. There came a day when he looked around at his life and realized he no longer felt like a guest in his own story. The rooms of his days weren't filled with the echoes of unmet expectations, the ghosts of apologies never received, or the distant hum of pretending. They were filled with stillness, with the sacred sound of someone finally belonging to themselves. It didn't happen overnight. There was no sudden epiphany, no thunderclap of realization. Just the quiet accumulation of moments, each one a small revolution. Saying no when he would have said yes. Pausing when his old habits pushed him to please. Choosing presence over performance. Over time, those moments built something stronger than any external affirmation could ever offer: self-trust. And with that trust came a new way of seeing, not just the world, but his own reflection. He stopped scanning his face for flaws, stopped criticizing his softness, stopped measuring his value by his productivity. He saw the weariness in his eyes not as failure, but as evidence of survival. He saw the lines forming around his mouth not as age, but as the pathways carved by 1,000 quiet smiles. There was dignity in his becoming, a kind of beauty that didn't shout, that didn't seek to be seen. It simply existed, quietly in the way he carried himself, in the way he no longer reached for what once made him feel small. He also began to understand the difference between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness had once been an ache, loud, aching, insistent. It would creep into his bones during those long nights when he missed what never truly existed. But now solitude felt like spaciousness, like room to breathe, like standing in the center of his own life, unbothered by the need to fill the silence with noise or the calendar with distractions. He didn't crave company for the sake of avoiding himself. He only welcomed what added harmony. Anything less, he blessed and released. There was a kind of healing that happened in the absence of noise. He noticed it when he walked under the morning sky before the city woke. He noticed it when he read something that moved him so deeply it made him pause mid-sentence. He noticed it in the way he no longer needed to defend himself in conversations that once left him drained. This was the healing that arrived not with dramatic rituals or declarations, but with softness, with breath, with the permission to simply be, to be tired, to be enough, to be whole, even if healing. He stopped shaming himself for the time it took, for the days when progress felt invisible, for the moments when old triggers resurfaced like waves he thought he had already outrun. Instead, he met himself with grace, with gentleness, with a new understanding. That healing is not linear, that sometimes you revisit old wounds not because you're backtracking, but because you're seeing them with new eyes. And this time you're not afraid. This time you stay, you listen, you let the wound breathe. He began to appreciate how far he'd come, not in miles traveled or mountains climbed, but in the quiet, unseen work of transformation. The kind that doesn't get celebrated, the kind that no one claps for. Like the moment he walked away from a conversation that would have wrecked his peace. Like the time he set a boundary without trembling. Like the day he finally admitted, "I'm not okay," and allowed himself to be held. These weren't grand milestones. They were sacred thresholds, and he crossed each one with courage, even if his knees shook while doing it. He no longer craved the spotlight, not because he feared it, but because he no longer needed it. The applause, the recognition, the validation, they were nice, but they weren't necessary. What mattered more was living in a way that felt honest, aligned, alive. He found joy in the ordinary, in the slow pour of tea, in the way the sun stretched across his floor in the afternoon, in the unexpected laughter that bubbled up during a walk with an old friend. These moments, unfiltered, unscripted, became his definition of wealth, and he redefined strength. It wasn't in how much he could carry, but in how willing he was to lay things down, to say, "I've carried this long enough," to recognize when his armor was no longer protection, but prison. Strength was in the surrender, in the softness, in choosing to feel when it would be easier to numb, in choosing to stay when running would have been more comfortable, in choosing to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because he did. He grew more intentional with the way he spoke to himself. The old voice, the one that whispered, "You're not enough," or "You're too much," still showed up sometimes, but now he recognized it, and he met it with compassion, not compliance. "Thank you for trying to protect me," he'd say, "but I don't need that story anymore." He didn't try to silence the inner critic with force. He soothed it with truth, with presence, with the steady rhythm of someone who knows they are worthy, exactly as they are. He started showing up differently in relationships too. Not trying to impress, not trying to perform, not trying to fix, just showing up, open, honest, real. He no longer feared being seen in his wholeness, even if it meant being misunderstood. Because the right people don't require your perfection. They love your presence. They honor your truth. And he began to magnetize those kinds of people, not by changing who he was, but by returning to who he'd always been. There were still moments of doubt, of course, still nights when the ache returned, when the silence felt too loud. But now he knew how to hold himself in those spaces. He didn't reach for distractions. He didn't spiral into shame. He just breathed, and in that breath he remembered. This is temporary. This is human. This is part of it all. He no longer needed every day to be joyful. He just needed it to be honest. And even in the ache, there was truth. There was beauty. And one day he stood in the mirror and didn't flinch. He didn't look away, didn't rush past his own reflection. He looked into his own eyes and whispered, "I see you. I love you. I'm proud of you." Not because he had become perfect, but because he had become free. And that freedom, that self-return, that quiet reclaiming of who he was before the world told him otherwise, that was everything. There's a shift that happens when you stop living in anticipation of the next disappointment, when you no longer brace for the crash after every moment of calm. He used to live like that, guarded joy, armored hope, always expecting the rug to be pulled out from under him. Because somewhere along the line, he was taught that peace was temporary, that love was conditional, that comfort was always followed by pain. But over time, he began to see that wasn't truth. It was trauma. The pattern wasn't prophetic, it was familiar. And just because something is familiar doesn't mean it's meant for you. So he started letting go of the fear of good things, letting himself enjoy the sweetness of a moment without waiting for it to sour. He smiled without questioning how long it would last. He allowed laughter to echo freely through his chest. He stopped treating happiness like a thief in the night and started welcoming it like an old friend finally come home. That in itself was a kind of revolution. To believe he deserved joy without earning it through suffering. To believe that stillness wasn't a warning, but a gift. He became more discerning about who had access to his time, his heart, his sacred spaces. Not because he was bitter, but because he had learned, often painfully, that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your growth. Some people come with scissors hidden behind smiles. They don't celebrate your healing. They tolerate it until it no longer serves them. And when you begin to rise, to glow, to reclaim yourself, they try to dim you back down to a version they can control. He didn't hate them. He simply didn't invite them in anymore. He saw the red flags he used to ignore with new clarity, the sarcasm that masked cruelty, the inconsistency that wore the costume of mystery, the apologies without changed behavior, the vague discomfort that settled in his gut but was always rationalized away. Before, he would have explained them away, tried harder, loved louder. Now he paused. He listened. He trusted his body, his intuition, his knowing. The signals were never the problem. It was his willingness to override them that created the harm, but not anymore. He learned that love isn't supposed to confuse you. It isn't supposed to leave you guessing. The right people don't make you question your worth, your sanity, your memory. The right people bring clarity, not chaos. They communicate. They show up. They hold space. And if you have to convince someone to choose you, it isn't love. It's fear masquerading as longing. And he was done performing for love. He was ready to receive it fully or not at all. His boundaries got clearer, firmer, quieter. He no longer explained them like disclaimers. No longer begged to be understood. No became a full sentence. That doesn't work for me became a sacred protection. He stopped waiting for people to respect his boundaries and started enforcing them himself. And in doing so, he found that the right people don't mind your edges. They respect them. They don't interpret your needs as rejection. They see your self-respect and respond with their own. He also unlearned the lie that forgiveness requires reconciliation. He forgave people who would never apologize, released people who never owned their part, not because he condoned the harm, but because he refused to carry the poison. Forgiveness wasn't for them, it was for his freedom. It was the act of saying, "You don't get to live in my head rent-free. You don't get to hijack my joy." Some people had caused damage so quietly, so subtly, that for years he didn't realize the weight he'd been carrying. But now he was laying it down. He sat in stillness often, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. He stopped needing constant stimulation, constant motion. He began observing his thoughts like clouds, watching them pass without needing to chase or catch them. The old stories, the ones that said he was too much or not enough, they still floated by sometimes, but he didn't grab them anymore. He nodded at them, let them drift. And in that practice, he found a kind of peace that no external source had ever given him. He became his own safe space. When the world felt overwhelming, when relationships felt fragile, when circumstances shifted without warning, he returned to himself, to the breath, to the present, to the still, sacred center that existed beneath the noise. That place had always been there, but now he knew how to reach it. He didn't need to escape anymore. He needed to remember that he was whole, that he was worthy, that peace wasn't something to seek, it was something to uncover. He celebrated his softness. For years, he'd been told to toughen up, to grow thicker skin, to not let things get to him. But now he saw his sensitivity as a gift, as a superpower. He felt deeply, saw beneath surfaces, loved without conditions. And while that had once left him wounded, now it made him powerful. Because when you learn to protect your softness without hardening your heart, you become untouchable in a different way. Not because you're invincible, but because you're rooted. Because your compassion is no longer naive, it's conscious. He also reclaimed his time. The minutes, the hours, the days he had once given away freely, sacrificed to things that didn't matter, to people who didn't see him, to patterns that didn't serve him. Now every hour was sacred. He spent it with intention, with care. Not every moment needed to be productive, but every moment mattered, even the ones spent doing nothing, especially those, because rest was not laziness, it was resistance, it was healing. It was a reclamation of humanity in a world that tried to measure worth in exhaustion. He reflected often, but not to ruminate, to integrate, to learn, to grow, to hold his past self with gentleness, and to use that knowing to move forward with wisdom. He no longer punished himself for not knowing better before. He thanked himself for surviving, for continuing, for being brave enough to evolve. And with each reflection came more clarity, not just about the past, but about what he wanted for the future, the kind of love, the kind of work, the kind of life. And in all of this, he began to trust again, not blindly, not recklessly, but with discernment, with open eyes and an open heart. He didn't let the pain of the past close the door to new beginnings. He knew the difference now, between red flags and challenges, between intuition and anxiety, between love and attachment. He trusted himself to tell the difference. And that trust, that changed everything. He woke up one morning and realized he didn't feel heavy. He didn't feel the familiar ache of needing to fix something, to prove something, to chase something. He felt light, present, at peace. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. And that feeling, that lightness, it wasn't because life was perfect. It was because he had stopped abandoning himself. And in doing so, he had come home. He no longer needed life to be loud in order for it to feel meaningful. Once he chased intensity like a fix, emotional highs, dramatic moments, grand declarations. He thought those were the markers of a life well lived, but they were often just noise, distraction. Now his soul leaned toward the subtle, the quiet moments that carry deep truth, the gentle smile of a stranger, the way the wind rustled through trees, the sound of his own breath at the end of a long day. Those things, once overlooked, became his grounding points. In a world that glorifies chaos, stillness had become his revolution. And with that stillness came awareness. He started noticing the patterns that once ran in the background of his life, like quiet scripts dictating his behavior. The impulse to please, the need to be chosen, the fear of being too much or not enough. These weren't truths, they were conditioning. He didn't blame himself for carrying them. He honored the part of him that believed those stories, because that part had kept him safe. But now he was safe in new ways, safe in his own voice, safe in his clarity. And those old scripts, they no longer held power. He gave himself permission to rewrite the narrative. No longer, I have to earn rest, but rest is a birthright. No longer, I'm falling behind, but I'm walking at my own pace. No longer, I need to prove myself, but I'm already enough. These weren't just affirmations. They were new foundations, replacing the cracked floorboards of his inner world with something solid, something sacred, a voice that didn't echo with judgment, but with compassion. He began to live more cyclically, like the moon, like the tides. He honored his highs and his lows. He didn't fight the ebb. He didn't force the flow. Some days he created endlessly. Others he barely moved. And both were sacred. Both were valid. He no longer demanded consistency from a being that was designed to shift. Instead, he learned to dance with the rhythm of his own nature. The pauses weren't failures. They were recalibrations. There was something else too, something he hadn't expected. The more he reclaimed his power, the more tender he became. Not weaker, just more open, more willing to cry when beauty pierced his heart, more willing to speak softness into rooms that echoed with hardness. He didn't need to dominate to feel strong. He didn't need to silence others to feel heard. His presence became enough. His being, his full, authentic being, spoke louder than any performance ever could. He stopped waiting for milestones to celebrate, for external achievements to validate his journey. Now he celebrated differently, quietly, deeply. The first morning he didn't wake with anxiety pressing on his chest. The afternoon he said no and didn't feel guilty. The moment he looked in the mirror and didn't pick himself apart. These were victories, not the kind that get applauded, but the kind that build a life worth living. He began to trust the timing of things, not passively, not by abandoning effort, but by releasing control over what wasn't his to hold. He planted seeds without obsessing over how quickly they grow. He let people go without needing closure that never came. He stopped chasing opportunities that required him to betray himself. And what he found was this: when he stopped forcing, life flowed. Not always easily, not always predictably, but with a quiet intelligence that he had once been too afraid to trust. He allowed joy back into his life, not as a reward for suffering, but as a companion to his healing. He danced again, not for anyone to watch, but because his body remembered freedom. He laughed loudly. He sang off-key. He let himself be ridiculous, and he no longer needed a reason. Joy didn't have to be earned. It could simply be invited. It could exist right alongside grief, alongside uncertainty. He didn't wait for a perfect day to feel alive. He claimed aliveness in the imperfection, and as he walked this new path, something beautiful happened. His presence began to change the energy of the spaces he entered. Not because he was trying to fix anyone, not because he was teaching or leading, simply because people could feel it, the groundedness, the peace, the authenticity. He became a mirror, not reflecting their image, but their truth. He didn't demand others to be like him. He just lived fully, and that gave others permission to do the same. He started honoring endings. For so long, he'd grieved them like failures, like evidence of brokenness. But now he saw them differently, as sacred closures, as chapters completing themselves. Not every person, place, or experience is meant to last forever. Some are bridges, some are doorways, some are simply mirrors showing you something you needed to see before you moved on. He no longer clung to what was fading. He blessed it, thanked it, let it go. He also stopped pretending he was always okay. That was a big one. The mask of strength he had worn for years, the smile that didn't reach his eyes, the "I'm fine" that shut every door. He took it off, piece by piece, not for attention, not for sympathy, but because it was heavy, because it was false, and because he realized that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the birthplace of connection, of truth, of healing.